What is going on, CaneSport's Izubee Charles, joined by Stephen Wagner for the Inside Canes Recruiting Podcast. Stephen, it has been a crazy week down there in Coral Gables after Miami landed the number one prospect in the 2026 class, Jackson Cantwell. But the dust has settled a little bit, and we've had some time to kind of reflect on just how big of a commitment that was for the Miami Hurricanes. And you actually had the chance to talk to Jackson Cantwell about his pledge to Miami. What went all behind that? So without holding on too long, let's just jump right into it. Stephen, how was your conversation with Jackson Cantwell? What are some things that he said to you that really stood out?
Yeah, well, you definitely are right. This was a massive, massive historic recruiting win for Miami. First time that they've landed the number one overall player in the country since DJ Williams back in 2000. But, of course, whenever DJ committed to Miami, rankings were kind of, in their infancy. The idea of recruit rankings was still, pretty new. The internet certainly isn't what it is today. We don't have four major recruiting databases who all have experience ranking players, and we don't have an industry or anything like that, or some sort of composite or anything like that. But Jackson Cantwell coming to Miami is nothing short of absolutely massive. I caught up with him Saturday morning. He kind of took me inside his decision. So the way that he kind of laid it out to me was, going into his final visit weekend, when he took that trip to Georgia, he was down to Miami and Georgia. It was basically those two teams. We heard a little bit of buzz around Oregon here and there, but that was pretty consistent with what we were thinking too. We also thought it was probably going to be Miami or Georgia. He goes to Georgia. Georgia rolls out the red carpet for him. Georgia makes, kind of their one final push. But what he told me was whenever he got on that flight from Atlanta to go back to Nixa, Missouri, he said that he kind of started, thinking to himself, okay, I'm going to have my mind made up on where I want to go one way or another by the end of this flight. And he basically used that flight to just kind of, compare and contrast everything that Miami and Georgia had to offer. In the end, it did end up coming out favorably for Miami. I think a lot of people, don't really realize this because obviously, elephant in the room is NIL. We all saw the reports of, what Miami was offering Jackson Cantwell. I don't, in terms of, what a player is or isn't getting. I think in today's age of college, I'm trying to figure out the way to word this, but, in today's age of college football, it would be ignorant if we all just acted like NIL plays absolutely zero factor at all. But I think what we all do need to understand is Miami was recruiting Jackson the hardest right up until his decision. He'd been saying, Dan Lanning was his favorite head coach. Georgia is obviously Georgia. Georgia has produced, I think they've averaged producing a first-round offensive lineman, I think every other year or something like that since Kirby Smart took over. Obviously, you don't necessarily think O-line when you think of Georgia, but they've had the production. They've won championships. But Miami, Mario Cristobal and Alex Mirabal absolutely went all in on Jackson Cantwell. They were absolutely determined to get him to Coral Gables. And that really, really resonated with Jackson. Like that struck a chord with him. That Mario Cristobal and Alex Mirabal really wanted him that badly. And that combined with just, the resume of offensive line development and the Hurricanes' history of, or this coaching staff's history of having offensive linemen that, went 3-and-out, went to the NFL. Even whenever you go back to Mario Cristobal's time as an offensive line assistant at Alabama, or as the offensive line coach and an assistant coach at Alabama. It really is pretty impressive. And I think that just really struck a chord with Jackson. He ends up deciding on the plane. Yeah, he did think he wanted to be a Hurricane. What he told me was he let his family know at the baggage claim while they were waiting on their bags. He said, guys, I think I'm leaning toward Miami. I really think I want to be a Hurricane. Believe it or not, he never actually told Miami staff formally. There was never that moment where, he picked up the phone and, he called Mario Cristobal or he called Alex Mirabal or he called Dennis Smith and he said, guys, I'm ready to be a Hurricane. I'm ready to do this thing. What he told me was about 20 minutes or so before he committed to Miami, whenever he was having his big announcement on his high school's YouTube channel, he said he picked up the phone, he called Mario Cristobal, and he said, "Coach, you're going to want to tune into this announcement." So Mario Cristobal at the ACC spring meetings, he finds a little corner. He pulls out a laptop. He sits down. He finds 5 minutes to be able to watch Jackson Cantwell make his announcement. Cantwell puts on the Miami hat. He throws up the U. We all see the video of Mario Cristobal freaking out, and the rest is history. Jackson's a Hurricane. He's completely shut down right now. Miami's the only school he's entertaining. Miami is the only school that he will take an official visit to, and he is going to be a Hurricane once we get to signing day in December. He is really, really amped up about it. He's got no second thought, or he's not second guessing this at all. He is absolutely fully in on the Hurricanes. He is excited to be in Coral Gables.
Yeah, Steven, that's awesome to hear. And leading up to the Jackson Cantwell commitment, I felt like we talked about him on every single Inside Canes recruiting podcast, and I felt like some people started to get tired of it, like, oh, he's not coming here and this and that. But at the end of the day, this was absolutely a massive, massive, massive recruiting win for the Hurricanes and Mario Cristobal. And we've known Mario to land some big fish, back in the day, whether that be Oregon with Kayvon Thibodeau, Panay Sewell, or recently with, at Miami with guys like Francis Mainoa, Ruben Bain, and obviously he had, a few misses with guys like Jeremiah Smith and DJ Pickett, which I mentioned. But Steven, to you, how big of a win was this for Mario Cristobal and Miami Hurricanes landing Jackson Cantwell versus a program like Oregon or Ohio State or even Georgia? How big was this for Mario Cristobal?
Well, I mean, I don't think that, words can really do justice, just how huge of a deal it is for Miami to be able to get a guy like Cantwell, especially considering that, these are the guys that Mario Cristobal was brought here to land. Cristobal, his reputation is as a recruiter. He's, I think right now, he's probably a top 2-3-4, honestly, recruiting coach in the country, recruiting head coach in the country. I think Dan Lanning has to be up there. I think Kirby Smart obviously has to be up there. You could probably make the argument for Ryan Day too, with some of the guys he's brought to Columbus. But Mario was brought to Miami to elevate Miami's recruiting to the level that it's been at previously, and the level that everyone knows its recruiting has to be at if they're going to compete for national championships. Whenever Miami was consistently competing for championships in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s, this is what Miami's recruiting classes were looking like. It was 5-star after 5-star, and then high 4-star, and then high 4-star. And Mario's first class here absolutely lived up to those expectations. His second class here, whenever they had that top 5 class and they really loaded up on D-line talent, that absolutely lived up to expectations. And then last year, all of these guys that we expected Miami to flip, that we expected Miami to ultimately land, they just never got him. We thought they were going to get DJ Pickett. They didn't. We thought they were going to get TJ Alford. They didn't. We thought they were going to get Ben Hanks. They didn't. There was a time where we thought they were going to get Dallas Wilson, and they didn't. Getting guys like Cantwell, I think is, it reinforces that, no, Mario Cristobal can get the guys that we all think Miami should be getting. And this is certainly the caliber of player that Miami needs to be getting, because they've proven that they've already done it before. I mean, for Cristobal, this isn't about taking Miami somewhere, it's never been before, because Miami's been there before. This is just about returning to where Miami previously has been, because we all know that, the base is there, the program prestige is there, the glory and the hype around the U absolutely is there. It is a very real thing. It's not like, Mario Cristobal is having to do what, Elijah Drinkwitz is at Missouri, and all of a sudden, he's having to turn Missouri into a destination for potential 5-star players. Miami's always been a destination for 5-star players. It's an attractive market for NFL free agents. It's an attractive market for NBA free agents. The idea of living in Miami, and it's now in today's age of college football, I think it's a pretty attractive destination for college football, free agent type of players, whether it's at the high school level or at the or guys that are coming in through the transfer portal. We know that, Miami can be as competitive on the NIL front as anyone in America. We know that Miami has the resources, the facilities, the coaching, the everything, objectively speaking, to be able to lure these top players to Miami. And finally, they did get, the kind of player that we were all sitting around waiting for Miami to land last year. Even though, I think, the only really true 5-star caliber player that Miami ended up getting last year was Hayden Lowe, and he didn't become a 5-star until, the final rankings update. But Miami wanted to go really heavy on the O-line in this class, and with guys like Cristobal and Mirabal, you expect Miami to land the cream of the crop in offensive linemen if they're going to come out and say that they want to focus on the O-line in a certain recruiting class. So Jackson Cantwell committing to Miami, I think this sets the Hurricanes recruiting class up absolutely beautifully. Kind of turning the page and now looking toward, what we're going to be looking for in the rest of Miami's offensive line class. The Hurricanes now have 3 very good offensive tackles. They've got Jackson Cantwell, best overall offensive lineman, in some cases, best football player in America. They've got Ben Congdon, who is a rising 4-star who cracked the top 300 this past cycle, or this past recruiting update during the spring. Really good wrestler, awesome ceiling, projects really, really well, has a bunch of really fantastic traits and characteristics. Then you've got Joel Irvin on top of that, a guy who I don't think enough people really truly appreciated and understood just how high Joel Irvin was on Miami's board. Those are 3 guys they feel great about, they are really enthused about. Then on top of that, you also have J.J. Sparks committed as an interior lineman, and they're still going after guys like Brett Colajay, Cannon Pickett, Ryan Moret. Colajay and Pickett are absolutely the 2 highest ranked interior linemen left on the Hurricanes board. Hurricanes really love both of those guys. I think that it's incredibly likely that Miami lands one of those 2. I think getting both, it's not impossible. It will be a little bit more difficult, but it won't be impossible. Then, you also have guys like Ryan Moret still on Miami's board, and then, Kenai Pepe, committed to USC. He's someone that Miami would certainly still like to have. If he is willing to come over from USC. But, with the Hurricanes now having 3 offensive tackles already committed in this class, I'm not really sure what the rest of Miami's offensive tackle picture would really look like if they were to go in and try to add more tackles. But undoubtedly, this is shaping up to be an absolutely elite offensive line class.
Yeah, I love how you mentioned that because, when the 2025 cycle kind of came to an end and, we talked about all that cycle was defensive back. Miami's going to go after a lot of big-time defensive backs. And then when people started asking us, hey, what's that, position group going to be in 2026? Instantly, we always said offensive line. And, landing the number 1 offensive lineman in the country is absolutely huge for Mario Cristobal. And like you said, I don't think words can put together how big of a win this was. And, I joked about it, when we did our live instant reaction talking about Cantwell. I said, obviously, giving it to Oregon, his old school, is a huge plus for him. But, Georgia, Kirby Smart, like I said, have been kind of the bullies of college football the last 5 to 6 years, winning multiple national championships and just going head-to-head with those guys and landing the number 1 prospect in the country is absolutely massive for not only, what they're trying to do on the field, but off the field as well on the recruiting trail. After Jackson announced his commitment, or, before whatever, I spoke with, a few prospects who had a lot of great things to say about it, and even caught up with Javian Mallory a few days ago on Friday after his spring game, and he was even shocked about it. He's like, man, he had that last visit to Georgia. I really thought he was going to be a Bulldog, but when he committed to Miami, it was absolutely awesome. And I was like, hey, as a running back, seeing Miami prioritize that offensive line, how cool is that for you? He's like, that's amazing because as a running back, those are the big boys you're going to run behind. And, he mentioned the other linemen in Miami's class. So the recruits are really loving, this pickup for the Canes. And he even talked to 2027 Miami commit Ken Dobbs out of Miami, Norland. He said he wants to see that 2027 class continue to build off what this 2026 class is doing and kind of help bring Miami back to a national championship contender, which I think they'll do if they keep recruiting at this pace. And, Stephen, we've talked about how big of an impact it was for, Coach Cristobal and everything. But just for you, what do you think this is going to do to other recruits when they see Miami land the number 1 prospect in the country, a guy like Jackson Cantwell, who could go on anywhere in America?
Well, with offensive linemen, I'm not sure what this is actually going to do because, while this is absolutely going to be a ringing endorsement for some players, as far as offensive linemen go, or as far as other positions go, whenever you look at offensive linemen, it's not uncommon for, players to see a player commit at their position and then kind of say, well, there's just, they're taking too many guys at this spot. Yeah, I think I'm probably going to look elsewhere. I think I'm probably going to stick elsewhere. So, I'm not really sure what this is going to do at tackle. I do think, however, that this is a ringing endorsement for Miami's options at guard. Like I said, they would still love to add Brett Colajay and or Cannon Pickett at it, along the interior. Both are, guards who are really, really high on the Hurricanes board. I've heard some people say that they don't think there's a better interior offensive lineman in the country than Brett Colajay. I certainly think that he is way the heck up there. I think he might be a consensus 4-star prospect now. But right now it's kind of Miami and Georgia for Brett Colajay. He's been straight up and said that NIL will play a factor. So we'll kind of see how, things end up on that front. That's something that we'll probably end up learning a little bit more about on official visits, once these conversations actually end up taking place, about, what programs are and aren't willing to offer as far as NIL goes. But kind of looking at other positions, I mean, you have to think that this is going to be a significant boost to the running back position or to Miami's running back recruiting. I mean, what running back doesn't want to go play behind, behind an offensive line class that is shaping up to arguably be the best O-line class in the country. I think that this really helps Miami's chances with Derek Cooper, honestly, knowing that Miami is going to get the cream of the crop to block for him up front. Javian Mallory, I mean, you said it yourself, man, he's really, really excited about being able to play behind Jackson Cantwell. I have to believe that Darion Coleman is probably going to be pretty amped as well. But even as far as, just kind of looking beyond the offensive side of the ball and, maybe looking at some of these positions that, might have absolutely nothing to do with an offensive tackle. I do think that, the number one player in America, trusting Mario Cristobal with his development and, putting him in a position to succeed for the next 4 years. I do think that says, something positive to, other positions. I think that that's a good endorsement for linebackers, for safeties, for corners, for receivers. Because, here you have, the most highly touted player in America who's, telling Cristobal and, telling Miami staff, guys, I believe in you. I really think that you guys are going to be able to get the most out of me. I think that there are absolutely going to be some players at other positions that are going to, kind of feel the same way, and that message is going to kind of resonate with a little bit. I do think that, there would have been a chance that this could have affected Miami's quarterback recruiting if, the quarterback position was still open and they were still looking for a guy. But, they already have Darion Coleman, so I don't think they have too much to worry about there. But like I said, I do think that, this could have an impact on, the Hurricanes' chances with Derek Cooper.
Yeah, I'm excited to see who's going to be next and see if that Cantwell cosign will help Miami land some other big whales, because they always make the jokes about, hey, we need a big whale, and not many bigger than Jackson Cantwell physically and literally. Obviously, kid is an absolute beast. Saw the video of him, I think, close grip benching 485. I was like, wow, that is insane. The kid is just all you want and more in a prospect. And I know Hayes Fawcett tweeted something about him scoring a 33 on the ACT in the 8th grade, all his accolades in track and field too, and then obviously being number one prospect in the country. Literally one of those can't miss prospects, and Miami didn't miss and landed Jackson Cantwell. And Steven, kind of to wrap out this year, we're going to kind of close the spring, recruiting window and kind of starting to head into OVs a little less than 2 weeks into the first official visit weekend, kicking off down there on Coral Gables. And obviously we'll talk about that a lot more next week. But as we kind of transition from the spring recruitment to the summer recruitment, the official visits, just what are you looking for? What are you excited to see, down there in Coral Gables as Miami's top 2026 targets all roll through those doors and get their first, real look at what that Miami program has to offer them?
So Miami's at 10 commitments right now. I think there's a great chance they get 10 more before the start of the fall season. I think between June, July, and August, I think they'll probably end up averaging somewhere around 3 a month, maybe even 4 a month. So I do think that the bulk of Miami's class is going to be fully committed by the time the fall season starts. This is as good a shape I can remember Miami being in from a recruiting standpoint since I've been here. Right now, I don't really see a commit on Miami's commit list that I'm really worried about, or that I think might potentially end up elsewhere. I guess sort of Jordan Campbell. He's still shopping around a little bit, but other than that, I mean, I feel awesome about where Miami sits with all of these dudes. Everyone's really really solid with the Hurricanes. Everyone's pretty locked in. Like I said, obviously we're keeping our eyes on Jordan Campbell. But I definitely think that Miami's probably going to flip some guys this spring or this summer too. I think there's a great chance Miami flips Jermichael Garrett from Auburn, the 4-star linebacker commit. I think there's going to be a really good chance that Miami's able to land Justice Fitzpatrick, the 4-star kind of safety cornerback hybrid from St. Thomas Aquinas and Minka Fitzpatrick's little brother. I think they'll have a really good shot there. I still think the Hurricanes are in an awesome spot with Derek Cooper, who I think is probably going to have a chance to be the most explosive athlete that Miami could land this in this year's class. Just from an overall like touchdown scoring ability. He really is one of those guys who has the chance to take any touch to the house. You give him the ball, he really is that level of explosive. Kind of looking at receivers, I think Miami's in a great spot with Samori and Wingo. It's kind of a Miami-Florida battle there. They've been going back and forth, but I do think there's a good chance that Miami does end up landing him ultimately. Jason Lopez, kind of the shifty slot receiver from Chaminade, he recently became a 4-star on 300 receiver. Miami's doing really, really well there. Obviously, the Hurricanes want to keep chipping away at Calvin Russell. Continue to hear a lot of pro Syracuse things kind of in Russell's circle, but they're right there for him too. This really is as good a class, or this really is going to. Miami's really going to have as good a chance as I can remember to really secure an elite class. Even if the Hurricanes, in the final rankings don't end up in the top 5, I still think there's going to be an awesome chance that Miami is going to end up getting a really, really good number of guys that are incredibly high on their board. If not some of the guys who, were the top overall players on their board at certain positions.
Yeah, I'm gonna be super excited to see, like you mentioned. I think this summer is gonna see a lot of more kids announce that pledge to Miami. Because they pick up that Miami hat and put it on. So we're gonna be tuned in to seeing what is going on, and we'll have you covered all throughout the summer at CaneSport.com with all the juice from the official vids and everything in between. If you like this video on YouTube, leave a huge thumbs up. Really helps with our algorithm, all that we do at CaneSport.com. And if you're not already a part of the CaneSport family, make sure to head it out. If you're not, try that 1-week trial to see how we get down over there with Steven dropping his bold predictions that come true. Hopefully some of them don't go through with some recruits, but he did call out that Cantwell one, so have to give him kudos to that, and everything else that we do at CaneSport.com. So for Steven Wagner, I'm Izubee Charles. Thank you all for watching.